This Okay. It's working. All right. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Magdalena Skipper. Thank you very much for being with us tonight and for giving us your time. We're very excited. Everybody's joining from across the university, students and faculty, and even outside the university. Some interested people from around the world heard that you're going to give a talk, and they're all excited and want to attend and listen and be able to ask you questions. First, I'll introduce you to our audience. So Dr. Magdalena Skipper is editor-in-chief of Nature and chief editorial advisor for the Nature portfolio. She's a genetist by training and holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge in the UK. She has considerable editorial and publishing experience, having worked as chief editor of Nature Reviews for genetics and genomics at Nature and editor-in-chief of Nature Communications. She's passionate about mentorship, research, integrity, as well as collaboration and inclusion in research. Wow, all music to our ears. As part of her desire to promote underrepresented groups in research in 2018, she co-launched the Nature Research Inspiring Science Award for Women Early Career Researchers, which I am proud to have been on the jury in one of its iterations as well. So thank you very much, Magdalena. And Magdalena is going to give us a talk around 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience. She will be talking about Nature, the magazine, the journal, over 150 years of holding up a mirror to science. And please take notes, write in the chat, and now, so welcome very much, Magdalena. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rana, for this lovely and very warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. And indeed, it has been a real pleasure to work with you in the past, including on the award that you mentioned. And of course, I look forward to many other opportunities in the future. So, and thank you to all of you for joining this session. I always say on these occasions that, of course, it would have been so much nicer to be with all of you in person and actually see you in person, but at least this way we have more flexibility and we can meet this way. So I will start sharing my slides and hopefully you will see them in a minute. Okay, now I need to be able to see them myself. Perfect. Just 1 second. Okay. All right. So I will do this. In fact, maybe even start at the beginning of my presentation. And can I just double check that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can. We can hear you and see the screen and see you as well.
Wonderful. Okay. So the reason why I chose this particular topic is because I wanted to give you a sense of how a journal such as Nature reflects the evolution and progression of science, how science, what is discovered, how science is done, and actually, very importantly, who does science. And throughout this talk, you will also get a sense of how individuals like myself, those who used to be active researchers but who became professional editors, dedicating full time to being a research editor, how they themselves contribute to this enterprise of disseminating scientific knowledge. So throughout the presentation, keep in mind that I'll be talking about Nature, the journal, but all the while, the examples, the vignettes that I've selected reflect that transition, the evolution of science, of research itself, what has become important and continues to be important for us. So Nature is over 150 years old. And of course, 150 years ago, 152 years ago now, the world was really very different. And it's in that context, I think it's instructive to think about what science was like, but also what Nature as a publication was like when it was first launched. So, back then, only just over 30% of people on this planet could read, whereas, of course, now it's almost 90%. 34, only 34% were free from extreme poverty. Now it's some 90% who are free from extreme poverty. And there's striking difference in average life expectancy. Back then it was in fact only 38 years, whereas now it's 71. And so the context, the whole sort of historic and everyday context into which nature was launched was really very, very different. So much has changed since then. One thing that has not changed, though, since our launch back in 1869 is our mission. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you is that that mission, it was really insightful to create it in the way that it was created back then, because that mission remains so very appropriate for today's world, even though that world has changed so much in so many different ways. So there is this dual aspect to nature's mission. Not surprisingly, the first aspect of our mission is to serve scientists through prompt publication of significant advances. And significant advances in any branch of science. Of course, Nature is a multidisciplinary journal, and essentially no area of scientific research is out of scope for Nature. And I'll come back to the issue of our scope in just a minute. But there is an important second aspect to our mission, and that is we want to ensure that these results of science are rapidly disseminated to the public throughout the world. And the mission said, in a fashion that conveys the significance for knowledge, culture, and daily life. And this dual aspect to our mission is really reflected in our structure. If you think about Nature, it comprises what we refer to as the magazine part. So the news, the expert opinion content, which is much more rapidly published and often looks at extremely current events that are pertinent to science. And of course, we have the journal part, if you like, the research, which we publish in our pages. And of course, that's the part of Nature that you author as researchers as you write up your papers. So I mentioned scope. So let me allow me to sort of indulge in a few minutes of looking at some awesome science which we have published in our pages. And so here's one example of what started out as basic science, which had led to some really impactful policy, which is incredibly current and topical today. So back in the 70s and then throughout the 80s, leading into the 90s, we published a series of papers that looked at the effect of CFCs on the ozone layer. And of course, then we showed, or it was shown in our pages, that CFCs themselves were leading and how they were leading to destruction of the ozone. Now that in itself, subsequently, just over 30 years ago, led to what is known as the Montreal Protocol, which was a universal global agreement to the banning of CFC-like substances, so substances that have this detrimental effect on the ozone. And what's beautiful about this is that now, 30 years on, we are able to show with scientific rigor, and the bottom of the slide you can see a paper we published about a year and a half ago, that this banning of CFCs has had a real impact on the ozone in the atmosphere. And of course, the further reaching consequences of this, in fact, that there is a very specific effect on the atmospheric circulation, but also in the southern hemisphere specifically. So a wonderful example of some basic science published a very long time ago, translated into a policy where today we see real effects in real life. So Rana mentioned to you that I'm a geneticist by training. So of course I couldn't possibly not share with you this example, the Human Genome Project. You of course will know that there were two publications simultaneously. One, the public effort was published in the pages of Nature, and the private effort to sequence the human genome was published in Science. Incredibly fundamental research, which has led to our understanding of human biology, human diversity, as well as, in fact, by extension, biology and diversity of other species, and indeed our relatedness to other species on this planet. The Human Genome Project also had many other important implications. One, as is highlighted here on the slide, had real economic impact. And of course, another was the fact that in the life sciences, it was one of the first examples of very large collaborative projects. Very clearly, a project like this could not have been done by a small group or a single lab. And again, keep this in mind. I will come back to the issue of collaborations towards the end of my talk. Now, talking about awesome science, I'm going to fast forward and bring us to the present. And of course, we are all united by the current crisis, by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been publishing rapidly and extensively on the topic right across the different formats. So, of course, original research, as well as expert opinion and review, but of course also the news. It's something that editorially is a very important theme for us. And especially using our news publishing, we are able to report extremely rapidly on science developments that are pertinent to the pandemic, or even the evolution of the virus itself, which of course by extension is relevant to the pandemic. We also look at the effect of the pandemic on the working life, on your working life as scientists. So many of us have been working from home. And of course, if you're doing computational work, your work may be less affected than if you're doing lab-based work for obvious reasons. We've all had to grapple with adjusting to very different dynamic of working, and indeed thinking about how the future of science and its dynamic may be affected by the pandemic. And that's indeed, or in the aftermath of the pandemic, and that's indeed what we've been publishing on as well. Historically, Nature's focus has been very much on the natural sciences. That has been our strength for the vast majority of our history. But that is changing. It began to change quite some time ago already, or I would say maybe within the last 10 years for sure. We're looking at topics which are much more closely relevant to sustainable development goals, for example, but also education, public health issues, social sciences. I'm sharing with you topics, titles of papers which some 15, 20 years ago would have never been considered in Nature. They would simply have not been considered in scope for Nature. But it's not just the subject areas that we are expanding our minds about, but it's also the types of studies that we consider, and to some extent, the format. So it is commonly believed that Nature does not consider replication studies, it does not consider case studies, and it does not publish null results. Well, on this slide, I'm showing you examples of each one of these. In fact, some of these examples provide an example of more than one. So let's just take the first example in the top left of the slide. This was a paper published in the spring of 2019. It's a case study. It's also a replication study. In this particular instance, it's a paper describing the so-called London patient. It's a replication of a Berlin patient. You may be familiar with the story, where an individual who was HIV positive was effectively cured of HIV by having a hematopoietic stem cell transplant, because that individual suffered from a certain type of blood cancer. So again, in many ways, a very simple, conceptually very simple study, case study, N of one individual. In this particular case, exactly the same work was done previously on another individual, but the demonstration of it and the implication of the study are so profound that it was important to demonstrate that it was not a one-off, that this approach could be replicated successfully in a completely different setting, different patient, different location. And at the bottom of the slide, I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we are very keen on receiving papers that describe studies that are pre-registered. So you're probably familiar with this in the context of clinical trials. Clinical trials have to be pre-registered in order to then subsequently be carried out and be published. Now there is increasing interest in pre-registration of other types of studies where you spell out exactly what you're going to do in your proposed study. And in this case, the paper was submitted with a link to pre-registration. And so the reviewers and the readers, of course, will judge the study against the pre-registration as laid out openly in a public setting already. But Nature, as you know, and as I already indicated, is not just about publishing original research. We have a magazine part to Nature, which of course publishes, in which of course we cover a whole variety of different topics, often topics which are important to science, but if you like, adjacent to science, often politics, certainly policy. Let me draw your attention to a couple of examples here on this page. Over on the left-hand side, you see a news feature from May 2019, The Future of Science in Europe, very much looking at European Union's attitude to funding, to advancing science within its own system, but also how it sees science and its progression situated against the background, a more global background. Over on the right is an example of a news feature which actually was published in 4 parts, looking at the effect of Belt and Road Initiative in China, how that affects the world of science. So the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is very much talked about in the context of politics and the economy, much less so in the context of science, even though it has profound effect on how science collaborations play out, how science is funded, and how it unfolds, especially in Asia and Africa, as I'm sure you appreciate, but not only. So I talked about the what, and I talked a little bit about the how. So let's talk about the who. Back in 1869, science was done by very different types of people from who does science today. And I put together this very stark slide when we were celebrating our 150th anniversary. And you will, I hope, recognize certainly the individuals on the left, in many ways very, very sort of cartoonish, but just to give you a sense, for example, Darwin's Origin of a Species was published just a few years before Nature was launched. The individuals on the right are individuals who are active working researchers. I've selected an example of a life scientist, a material scientist, and a social scientist there. Very different demographic, which of course is very important because it means that different types of questions, a much greater array of questions, are being posed in the context of science and research. And of course, they're being answered in different ways, much richer ways. Back when we were celebrating our 150th anniversary, we wanted to look at how the authorship, women authors in our pages, whether those numbers were increasing. We took a very simple snapshot of what we published between 1980 and 2019. That was our 150th anniversary celebration. And actually, quite gratifyingly, we saw that rise in the number of women authors. The rise is not dramatic. And, the graph here stops at 30%, and 30% is the proportion of active women in research that is generally talked about, agnostic of discipline, which of course is appropriate to Nature because indeed we publish across the disciplines. Now, I hope very many of you here on the call would like to see that proportion increase, both in terms of the percentage of women who are active in research, but also in terms of percentage of women who are authors of papers in our pages. Coming back a little bit to the how science is done, back 152 years ago, or even 50 years ago, there wasn't so much emphasis on the how, much more emphasis on the what. Well, that emphasis, as I'm sure you appreciate, is shifting, and we are trying to support this, and we have been for quite some time. So, back in 2013, for example, we devised a reporting checklist, which has since become mandatory and is published with every paper. And it's a checklist which helps consolidate details about experimental design, analysis, statistical approaches, and so on. It's a checklist both for the authors themselves, but also certainly for the reviewers and for the readers subsequently. What's very gratifying about this is that when we surveyed our authors, 83% of them felt that it was significantly, they felt it was a significantly improved opportunity for them to report on statistics and analysis in the papers. Similarly, for a number of years, with increasing rigor, we require our authors to report on data and code availability. Again, it varies slightly between disciplines as to what makes sense and what is feasible. Just think of, for example, whether repositories are available in a given discipline or not. But this is something we increasingly convince our authors that they should voluntarily report on. And certainly a data and code availability statement are now a requirement for all of our pages. We have also been innovating in the space of peer review. We encourage our reviewers to review data. We encourage them to review code, and I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. And of course, we try to add transparency to how this peer review process proceeds. And I have another slide on this in a second. One final aspect relating to transparency is, of course, sharing of protocols. You may be aware of the fact that a long-term reproducibility study of cancer research has just come to an end. It was published in eLife, and in fact, we published an editorial summarizing these efforts just earlier this week. One of the fundamental conclusions that this study came to was that a major stumbling block towards reproducing the results and findings of others is lack of detail of how something was done. And so for that reason, it's very important for us to encourage our authors and provide them ways in which they can share protocols. Here's an example I promised you to show you how we try to support and facilitate code peer review. We have partnered with CodeOcean, who's a provider of software tools. Essentially, in this particular case, it's a capsule, a software capsule, which allows for code and data to be reviewed in an environment in which the code can be rerun. This is something we provide our reviewers with, where manuscripts require a lot of computational analysis. But once these manuscripts are published, we also offer these capsules to the readers, so they themselves can explore and see how the code behaves when the data are plugged into the particular code. I alluded to the transparency of research evaluation. We now, with the agreement of reviewers and authors, publish peer review reports at Nature. We started this almost 2 years ago, something that Nature Communications has been doing already quite some time before us. And we also thank our reviewers by name if they so desire. I think the recognition for peer review is definitely insufficient in the research community. I have to mention preprints, not just because depositing preprint, especially in the pandemic, has become of paramount importance. But also just to signal to you that not only has Nature seen preprints as being completely compatible with publishing in our pages. Just as a reminder, preprints, of course, are some 20 years old and originated in the physics community. But for some 2 years now, across Springer Nature, the publisher of Nature, all journals actually encourage their authors to deposit preprints. So it's not just that we allow it, but we actually actively encourage our authors to do so. And for COVID-related papers, we actually mandate it. We feel it's really important that information is shared widely. And one of the things that we decided to do to facilitate preprint deposition is actually we've established an additional our own preprint deposition server. And of course, we are completely agnostic as to which preprint server our authors deposit preprints on, but this is something else to support the efforts. Another way in which science and science publishing has changed since the launch of Nature is the fact that reluctantly, I would say, but science and scientists are beginning to realize that admitting mistakes is something that can be viewed, in fact, should be viewed as a positive thing. While nobody wants to retract the manuscript, whether it's an author or a journal, when a manuscript, when the authors and the journal and the community no longer have the confidence in the results of a manuscript, that manuscript, of course, needs to be retracted. There are many different reasons for which a manuscript may be retracted. Here's one example where the authors contacted us at Nature. In fact, it was a single author paper, very unusually for Nature. The author contacted us to say that by complete coincidence and mistake, they used an incorrect data set in their analyses, a data set which could not have given them confidence in the result which they reached. We retracted the paper, but they actually had the appropriate data set, which they used to reanalyze, asking the same question, using the same analytical approach. We ended up republishing the paper, of course, following peer review. So here's one illustration why retracting a paper can be a very positive thing, and transparency around it is important and needs to be talked about. In fact, we editorialized about this particular issue as well. Here's another example of a retraction where, and the reason why I'm sharing this one with you is because at the bottom of the page, you will see a very detailed description of why the paper was retracted, who alerted the authors to the problem in the data, and how the issue is being resolved. Concurrently, so this retraction note, if you like, is referenced in great detail to leading to publications, preprints, so the community engaged in this research can follow as the story unfolds, and the conclusions which no longer are supported in this paper are evolving. Of course, the case is not closed in that sense. Now, let me shift gears a little bit by coming back to this idea, who does science? I showed you this very dramatic picture before, which showed 3 men and 3 women trying to illustrate how science, who does science has changed. And of course, there were many other differences in that particular slide that I showed you just a couple of minutes ago. But the reality, of course, is much closer to this. Yes, teams are made up of individuals, but in the end, science is done in teams, and increasingly so. You, of course, all realize it. Looking at the issue through the history of the journal, you will be not surprised to hear that while many contributions to Nature in its early days were single author or just a couple of authors, today single author paper or just a couple of author papers are real rarity. And most of the time, author numbers run into tens or hundreds, again, depending on the discipline. Now, I want to spend a bit of time talking about team science and collaborations because I think it's incredibly important and it's increasingly important. Uh, the pandemic has actually shown us how important team science is and collaborations across disciplines. Just consider the biomedical research, which has led to the development of the vaccine, would not have been sufficient without social sciences research, which convinces or tries to convinces the general public to accept the vaccine, or tries to understand why is it that certain pockets of our societies refuse to be vaccinated. The vaccine development itself, of course, is an amazing demonstration of the importance of collaboration between academia and the industry. And there are many other examples. Um, with collaborations, we know that collaborations are on the rise, and that's pandemic notwithstanding. We also know that there is a citation advantage to collaborative endeavors and collaborative publications. And we also know that new collaborations, teams made up of fresh new members, um, that phenomenon is associated with more original and more multidisciplinary research. And of course, if you think about some of the biggest challenges that face us, some of the biggest challenges that science is going to be instrumental to addressing, those are global challenges, challenges that will require multidisciplinary answers. For that reason, I think we must keep the need for collaborations fresh in my mind, and we must learn to appreciate collaborations. Now, what goes hand in hand with collaborations is, of course, that diversity of approaches, the ways of asking questions, how those questions are going to be answered. I touched on this earlier. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes, or maybe just a minute, talking about what we are trying to achieve in nature to support and amplify diversity within research itself. A few examples here. One, for example, associated with diversity across career stages. There are a number of initiatives within the Nature portfolio, most notably in the Nature Reviews journals team, but also Nature Communications team, to work with early career researchers to support them in peer review, help them train as peer reviewers to become better peer reviewers and peer review more effectively and efficiently. Of course, a very important part of activity of any researcher. We also organize events, nature conferences. A couple of years ago, we introduced a new code of conduct for our events, and we also pledged that we will have so-called no more manels, so no more male-only panels, and we will strive for greater gender equity in keynote presentations and invited presentations. Well, just a couple of days ago, we published an editorial in which we looked back at our data from the last 2 years. And it was actually very gratifying to see that focusing so closely on who we invite to meetings, who we invite to be part of organizing teams on the conferences has really paid off. So back in 2019, when we started this effort, there were only about 27% of women who were actively involved in organizing, but also presenting at nature conferences. Now we are almost exactly at parity. So that's incredibly gratifying and very clearly an effort that needs to continue and needs to be extended to other aspects of diversity. In the introduction, Rana already spoke about the Nature Research Awards for inspiring and innovating science. That's a really important initiative, in my view, that showcases the achievements of early career researchers, women early career researchers. And the final thing I will mention is a section at Nature called Where I Work. It's a section which is really led with an image. We introduced this section some 2 years ago, where we wanted to showcase the variety of circumstances in which science and research unfolds. Especially the general public has this view that a scientist is somebody who wears a lab coat, is in a lab, and perhaps pipette in hand, a very particular sort of image. That's the kind of image that the general media tend to provide to the public. Well, that's of course only one type of an environment in which science unfolds. There are many others. What we have discovered almost by coincidence is that by showing where scientists work, we're also now showing who the scientists are, how diverse a group they are themselves. And that's something that's been a bonus, if you like, for us, amplifying that message through this particular um, format. Now, at the beginning, when I introduced my talk and how I was going to structure it, I said to you that all the while, all the things that I talked about in some way illustrate what editors, individuals like me, do in the context of research community, and how we can support researchers themselves on this journey as science and research evolve. And so here's one specific example from Nature Medicine, not Nature itself, but from Nature Medicine. You see the title of the paper here. The paper was focused on vaccine acceptance and hesitancy in low and middle income countries. And at the bottom of the page, you see a tweet from one of the authors who describes how the editor who handled the paper made the authors aware that a portion of the credit for the work that was done was perhaps off balance in the paper. So in the original version of the paper, all of the local collaborators were acknowledged that were not part of the author list. And it was as a result of the discussion with the editor, between the editor and the authors, that the authors decided to rebalance the author list and provide more appropriate credit to those who contributed to the study. I talked about collaborations already. I won't dwell on it for much longer, just to say that collaborations are not necessarily simple, and they require some work and some attention if they are going to be fruitful and indeed equitable. Just some 6 months ago, we published a special focus issue at Nature, where we provided a variety of guidelines, but also stories showcasing how topics and issues can be solved when collaboration is appropriately approached. And indeed, another example on this page is how to avoid pitfalls of inappropriate, imbalanced collaborations. Most of the time when we think about collaborations, we think about collaborations within the professional sphere of science. And I don't mean just academia. Of course, I include academia and industry or the private sector within it. But I think increasingly we would all agree that when we talk about collaborations, we talk about collaborations that extend beyond the core research community to those who have a stake in the research but don't necessarily have formal research training. A few years ago now, we had a special issue on co-production of research, and perhaps the best example of it is or in the medical clinical sphere, where patients and families of patients get involved in designing clinical trials for interventions from which ultimately they're going to benefit. And there are many other examples of it. In the context of sustainable development goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think all of us are talking much more about co-production of research, co-production that extends beyond the research community itself. Coming to the end of my presentation now, just a comment about this collaboration, broadening of perspective of topics that I talked about, and wanting to draw your attention to the fact that, of course, Nature itself is a multidisciplinary journal. We are able to achieve many of these things and accommodate much of increasingly collaborative and multidisciplinary research because we are a multidisciplinary journal. But of course, within the Nature portfolio, we also have Nature communications, scientific reports, all of which extend right across disciplines. And in recent years, we have launched a number of journals, each of which is transdisciplinary in some way. And so I'll just name a couple from this list that you can see here: Nature sustainability, nature food, or nature aging, for example. And they really transgress the boundaries of natural, applied, and social sciences. Throughout everything I talked about, everything that we have worked with the research community to achieve, to support them, is of course done by the editors. And so earlier this year, to complement Nature's mission statement, we came out with a set of editorial values, and we felt very strongly we wanted to put it out as a formal statement, something that we can refer to, something we can point to and draw upon. I won't go through the statement in detail because I touched on many aspects of it already. But our values extend to our belief in this transformational power of science, but also in our belief that everybody should be able to benefit and enjoy the fruits of scientific research. And of course, we believe that, by extension, we believe that science should represent everyone and therefore be diverse. And so, coming to the end, I talked about the editors, those who achieve it. They're, of course, not just the editors, they're the journalists, they are our production colleagues who actually make it possible for all of this to happen. Well, these are them. You can see them here. This photograph was taken just over 2 years ago when we all came together, before the pandemic, of course, when we all came together to celebrate our 150th anniversary. And so with this, I will stop and thank you for your attention and take any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Magdalena. That was a fantastic journey going through not just the history, but the transformations and the evolution, while accommodating with the changes, and which are all good and positive, raising awareness so that we're more inclusive and diverse globally to serve humanity. All right. So who would like to ask? You can either type in the chat, or you could just unmute yourself and ask. And if you want to also open your camera, that's fine. But if you don't, that's fine as well. So yes, please go ahead.
I should say that I'm very happy to, answer questions that I did not discuss about, career paths, sort of everyday reality of being an editor. So anything at all.
Yes, and any question is fine. There's no any question. Every question is relevant and important since it occurred to you. And if anybody wants to speak in Arabic and doesn't, fine, you can speak in Arabic and I'll translate. Feel free. اللي بده يحكي عربي عادي أنا بترجم. All right, we have a chat.
Yeah, there's a question there. What was the most fascinating discovery you've seen? A very interesting question. And I don't think it's possible to answer it with one single answer. Discoveries or the research that I have seen as an editor, I've appreciated it. So different papers, different stories, I've appreciated them for different reasons. So there are some fascinating and impressive stories, along the lines of, for example, the human genome, something which is transformational, is on a huge scale, is a thesaurus or a nice encyclopedia and a tool at the same time. There are other stories which are methods that completely open up new fields. for example, what's now happening in structural biology, where we're able to see molecules, in almost in situ, right, as they interact, has been facilitated by technical methodological discoveries. Um, Other examples could be examples of really elegant studies where really elegant design has been applied to address a question. So many, many different ways. I don't have one favorite story, but just a selection. But yeah, which is also a positive thing to say, because I just think it illustrates the fact that um, science is just exciting across the spectrum.
Absolutely. So you have two more questions in the chat.
Okay. A book you personally recommend? Oh. Um, okay, I've got one, and it's not a science book. Interestingly, it's actually something I read a few years ago now, but I talked about very recently with someone. Um, it's I don't remember the title, but I remember the author. The author's name is Rosita Forbes. The book was written in the 1930s, and she was an English woman who traveled in Central Asia. So her travel is starts in Tehran, and then she goes north, and then actually through Afghanistan and through Kabul, and then enters what's today Uzbekistan. The reason why I found this book particularly interesting is because she travels on her own in the early 1930s in places where a single woman would not be traveling, and certainly an English woman would not be expected to be seen. And her perspective, her drive and her desire, and actually disregard for expectations of her in her society at the time, I find really refreshing and really interesting. Um, I find it's often interesting to read books that were written, well, almost a century ago in this case. It was a very different world, very different perspective, but here written by a woman. I think it was really, really valuable. So there you go. That's my recommendation.
Wow,
Yeah.
it's amazing. I just put in the name, and if you Google it, you'll find there's a lot of books, actually, not one. So,
Yes, she's also traveled in the Middle East. The book that particularly captivated me was the one in Central Asia. But yes, she got around, it seems,
yeah.
at the time. Yes,
Well, I think the one from the Sahara to Samarkand, maybe that's, or whatever. Okay, it's easy. They can find her. Mm.
exactly, exactly.
All right, thank you.
So
Another question. Yeah.
please talk briefly about your career path. Right. So my career path is actually quite common to an editor, a professional full-time editor. So I studied genetics at University of Nottingham in the UK. And the reason why it was genetics is because right from high school, I somehow knew that I loved genetics, this idea of, principles of inheritance. Why are we similar to our parents and our family, and but not completely? Why are we similar and yet different? And this whole balance between nature and nurture always fascinated me as well. So I studied genetics, and then I went to Cambridge in the UK to do a PhD. Again, in genetics, I did my PhD on C. elegans, so very kind of classic genetic model. So it was developmental genetics, and I studied sex determination, which was fascinating. It's one of the fastest evolving traits in biology. So it was a really interesting process to study. And then I went to do a postdoc. For a postdoc, I moved to London to what was then called Imperial Cancer Research Fund, and now it's called Cancer Research UK. And my work was not directly related to cancer. Again, it was developmental biology, developmental genetics, which of course is indirectly pertinent to cancer. Of course, cancer is a disease of dysregulated growth. So you have to understand principles of development in order to really understand what goes wrong in cancer. But it was during that time, during my postdoc, that I actually became quite frustrated with how focused I had to be at that stage of my career. I had many interests in science, and so I was frustrated. I wanted to broaden them, and that was at that point I started to think, could I do something else? Could I make a contribution to research, to the research community, in a different way that didn't involve me doing research myself? So it was never a question for me to step away from science, to step away from research. I just enjoyed it too much. And actually, quite simply, I saw an advertisement at the back of Nature. I saw an advert for associate editor of Nature Reviews Genetics. And so I applied for the job, and I think I was so enthusiastic at my interview that, now I joke that I sort of bullied my interviewers into giving me the job. And so that really is, the rest is history, as they say. So, as Rana introduced me, I spent many years in Nature Reviews Genetics, then moved to Nature, had a couple of other roles within Springer Nature. And now, 3.5 years ago, I was appointed into the role of editor-in-chief of Nature. Then there is another question. Can I ask a question about the reviewing process? So Nancy, yes. Would you like to ask it?
Hi.
Hi.
For some reason, I can't open my camera. Okay. Yeah, it's open now. I'm just curious about the reviewing process of Nature. How do you pick the reviewers, and do you find it easier for people to come and review for Nature, or is it a bit intimidating? I would be very intimidated. I will think a lot if I get and let's say if you ask me to do the reviews. It's just because I find that Nature has this reputation that it needs to keep. So how do you pick your reviewers, and is it hard to get people to review your articles?
An excellent question. So the reviewers are selected by the editor, who is the handling editor for the paper. And of course, the most important guiding principle for choosing reviewers is indeed the content of the paper. So every technical aspect of the paper needs to be assessed by a technical reviewer. So reviewers are chosen for their ability to assess that, as I say, the methodology, the analysis of the paper. And as papers these days are more and more complex, often the reviewers don't have overlapping expertise, which is an interesting thing to keep in mind, because for that reason, the role of the editor becomes all the more important, because it's the editor who's then going to bring these comments, the comments of reviewers that were made through the prism of their own expertise, through the prism of their the domain that they work in, and consolidate them into a decision, and decision to pursue the paper and revise, and guide the author in how to revise, and so on. Now, in terms of who we actually choose, the idea is to choose the individuals to review papers who are, of course, not conflicted, who will be as unbiased as possible, and as constructive and professional as possible. Now, I emphasize this is because, while most researchers, of course, if they accept to review a paper, will do their best to review in a constructive way and an objective way, occasionally it happens, of course, we're all human, occasionally it happens that that's not the case. We do, therefore, very carefully evaluate the reviewer's input into the process, and sometimes we just choose not to ever again work with a researcher if we see that they're not professional, they're not constructive. As I say, these are very rare cases. Now, to your comment about being intimidated, I very much hope that you would not be intimidated by reviewing for Nature, because, of course, you're reviewing the paper itself. You should have, the authors should have included all the information in the paper that you will need as a reviewer or subsequently as a reader to evaluate whether the conclusion they have drawn is trustworthy, whether it stands, right? That's the principle of the paper, that you need to take the reviewer and the reader, and of course the reviewer is also the reader in the first place, to take them through your process, through your research process, so they can see that your conclusions are credible. And that's indeed, as a reviewer, that's what you evaluate. Now, if you are interested in developing your skills as a reviewer, then I would say look out again for these early career researcher programs, which I mentioned in my talk. So in those programs, we pair up individual early career researchers with editors, so they get feedback from editors on reviewing. So that's exactly the idea, to build up the confidence, build up the professionalism with which you can review the papers. Yes, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I've been an editor of one of the journals for like 10 years, and it was easier to find people now, people to review your articles before compared to now. And it's a good journal. It's one of the prestigious journals in genetics. But I really find it harder and harder for people to accept to review papers. And I've been to more than one conference, and people are always criticizing the type of science that's been published. And I think it's our fault at the end of the day, because we don't review. We always reject if somebody asks us to review anything. So thank you very much. It was very helpful.
Thank you. I think you just made it's a really, really important comment that, we do have to think about the fact that it's a kind of collective responsibility. If you don't review a paper, then you can't really criticize it, because you had an opportunity to contribute to its development. And similarly, the same goes for a journal. If we don't take a paper, don't publish a paper because we think it's problematic, but we might have had an opportunity through peer review and editorial work to make it better and publishable, then should we criticize it when it's published in another journal, right? So there is some collective responsibility. I agree. These are really important statements. I'm looking to more comments. Awa says she's having a problem with a microphone. I very much appreciate the idea that Nature publishes null results and repetitions. Thank you. My question is, do you find it hard and overwhelming to read articles from outside your field? So I do, yes, but the editors who evaluate the papers always evaluate the papers within their own discipline. So now, as editor-in-chief of Nature, I actually don't handle manuscripts anymore. I'm more charged with strategy, editorial strategy, policy, etc., etc. While of course keeping a very close eye on, for example, where we're moving with respect to our scope. But when I was a manuscript editor at Nature, I only handled manuscripts in genetics and genomics. Now that was still broader than my first-hand experience of research, but the principles that I dealt with, of course, were things that I was very familiar with. And as you can imagine, the further away you go in the sort of immediately adjacent fields, it's still quite possible to evaluate. But of course, if I go further away to chemistry or physics, that becomes, while you may understand what was done and how it was done, to be able to situate it in the context of the field becomes a real challenge. For this reason, all of our editors who deal with manuscripts directly are former researchers, and they're former researchers who have experience in that particular discipline. So there's another question here from Mohammed. What makes Nature magazine unique from other magazines? Very good question. So let me qualify your question. So when I read your question, Nature magazine, um, I think you're referring to the actual magazine part of Nature. So the part of Nature in which we publish news features, opinions, etc., etc. So I will answer the question in this way. I think what makes it unique is the focus on science and the incredible professionalism and familiarity with science by my colleagues. So reporters who work on Nature, commissioning editors who commission this opinion and expert authored content. We are completely focused on science and science adjacent topics. Now, during the pandemic, the general media talks about science, talks about issues related to science, but it's at a different level. And in my view, it's going to be transient. I think once we're out of the pandemic, we will talk about it less. I mean, look, the pandemic is not the only crisis that faces us. Of course, climate change is one obvious other one. And the climate change didn't start yesterday, and yet we haven't been talking and paying attention to science quite as much. So it's a matter of intensity and the sort of the patience, the space that the general media have. So Nature in this sense, Nature magazine in this sense, fulfills a really unique function. And of course, it's also its proximity to the original research which we publish. And I think it's that synergy. So it's the journalism with the science and the professionalism that sort of, united that offer to provide a unique offering to the researchers themselves, but also, and crucially, to the policymakers and the politicians, I think. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, actually, I want to just follow up on what you said, Magdalena. I'm not sure if he meant Muhammad meant the magazine or the journal, and it just mixed up the translation. But either way, you've answered it. I just want to point out why I think also Nature magazine, as a scientist, as a researcher, and as an instructor from the Middle East, that it's a wonderful resource because there's a Nature Arabic, and I always tell my students that's your foremost reference. If you have a question, especially now with raised awareness to science because of COVID, everybody has questions, and there's a lot of, social media misconceptions going around, that go back to a trusted resource. And I always recommend Nature in Arabic, and there's a magazine section for that. That's for the general public, and people can trust that. And then if they want more, they can go and read the English. But to me, that's a valuable resource. It's like to sift through all the knowledge and to make sure that you're accessing something that you can trust. So I want to add that, and a shout out to thank you, because you're only one of the rare ones, because even Science doesn't have an Arabic version. They have other stuff like Scientific American version in Arabic, but not what you're doing. And I think in that sense, you are special as well.
Thank you. I think it's important because, of course, while English is the language of science, we do want, going back to our mission, we do want to bring these fruits, these results of science to a wider audience, and not everybody is extremely proficient in English, right? So we have to make these efforts.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful last question here for you.
Okay, shall I read it? That's a question from Nehaya. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. So Nehaya's question is, well, thank you. It says, she's really proud that the chief editor of such a magazine is a woman. My question is, did you feel through your journey that it's harder on you than it would be for a man? Thank you for the question, and thank you very much for your comment. Very kind. So I have to say that this is the point where I have to mention my parents, and my dad is no longer around. But one thing that, from perspective of time, one thing that I've really come to appreciate is that my parents brought me up as me, as a person who happened to be a girl, as opposed to brought me up as a girl. So in that sense, I felt very supported in very early days to just explore and pursue whatever I was interested in. And, whether it was, what kinds of games I played, whether I played with dolls or something else, or whether I had interests that, I was pursuing in some other ways. And I was also supported by other educators in a similar way. And I think, at the time, as always is the case, at the time I didn't appreciate its importance, but of course in hindsight, that's really important. Overall, I have been fortunate enough that in my life I've not experienced particular stumbling blocks or particular hardships because I'm a woman. What is definitely noticeable is that as I've adopted more senior roles, there are fewer and fewer people like me. Mm-hmm. So, and this is nothing new. We all know that we all talk about the leaky pipeline and so on. But the interesting corollary of this is that because there are fewer women in position of leadership, in position of influence, senior roles, when women are appointed into these roles, either there's surprise or there is excessive celebration, right? And I sort of say it almost flippantly, but it is interesting, and I have on at least one occasion met someone who was, who of course knew that editor-in-chief of Nature was a woman. But when I was met by this person, the first thing that person said was, "Oh, it's you." And I wasn't quite sure how to interpret this, but it certainly was not the most encouraging beginning of a conversation that we had. So I would say, against this background of actually, really appreciating this very supportive upbringing and not having that many challenges, it's now more than ever before that I find it's I guess the best way to put it is I am made more aware of the fact that I'm a woman than I ever was before, which is quite an interesting way of putting it.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think we're having question. Okay, well, this will be our last question, and then I want to share a few thoughts and future. There you go ahead, Magdalene.
So this question is from Yazan. What has been the most challenging thing about your scientific journey as editor-in-chief? The most challenging thing as editor-in-chief, I think probably, so it's not so much I guess it's not so much scientific journey, but in terms of a challenge in my current role, it's to do with the fact that nature has incredible history that is really full of incredibly valuable lessons. It's something to cherish and to celebrate. But in that history, there are some mistakes that we need to learn from. And like any system or any organism, any institution, we need to evolve. And so the interesting challenge is how to build on the history and preserve the valuable aspects of the history and evolve so that we can stay relevant, lead and support the research communities. And I think that's quite interesting because things are evolving around us quite fast. I think around all of us, I spoke about some of them during my talk.
Great. So I would like to ask you a last question before closing. Being editor-in-chief of Nature, what would what would you like your legacy to be?
You always you save the hard ones to the end, right? Well, it's a little early to think about my legacy because I've only been in the role for 3.5
I
years.
mean, but you're planning. I mean, what is it that
Yes,
you want to change to
yes,
leave that footprint?
yeah. Um, I think hmm, it's a difficult one, but the first thing that comes to mind, I think, is to set up systems within nature, our own way of working, so that we can become agile and sort of continuously evolve so that we serve the community appropriately in the way that is needed at the moment. So another way of putting it is, um, when I step down from this role, I guess I would like people to say, oh, nature became even more integrated into the community, listened more and reflected, but also led. So it's that partnership, I guess, with the community. I'd like to achieve some things towards that goal.
That's
You can
amazing.
invite me. You can invite me in a few years and see what's happened.
Yeah. No, this is amazing, and I think that's wonderful, and that would be a true transformation from how nature was in the beginning, only serving the scientific community per se, and to encompassing the wider community, global community, because everybody's important, as we've seen.
Yeah.
Well, and this is a shout out to students and colleagues here that the wonderful thing is that all of you can interact with science by writing a letter, commenting, sending a commentary. I've had a lot of experience doing that, and usually it's open. So we need your contribution so that truly Magdalena can fulfill her dream, that this is really a global community, everybody coming together, collaborating, talking to each other, and having a voice. And I also want to shout out, and I love how nature has extended beyond the basic sciences to take in
Mhm.
the social sciences as well, because we're seeing a blurring of how we interpret behavior, that we have to include them as well. So I think all those efforts are important for humanity, for solving all the challenges we're facing in the 21st century. So thank you for your time. We've went 20 minutes over, but it's been fascinating. I think we could keep on going, but I'm sure you need to relax and everybody has to go to sleep. But
Thank
thank
you.
you very, very much.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Take care. Take care. Bye bye. Thank you.